Center at Stockholm University and also a program director at the Beijer Institute of Ecological Economics at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of SRC, the Beijer Institute, and of course, the UNDP Human Development Report Office to this virtual roundtable that we have called Human Development and Finance in the Shadow of Anthropocene Risks. We have a list and a number of very prominent speakers today, and I will introduce them to you shortly in a bit, but I thought it might be a good idea just to give you a little bit of background in terms of three main points before we kick off these conversations. So three main points. The first point is, of course, that our planet is changing very rapidly. And by that, I mean, not only the growing recognition that our climate is changing, but also the fact that our living planet as a whole, the oceans, landscapes, the diversity of life is facing unprecedented changes. And our colleagues, for example, just showed recently that human activities have managed to push the Earth system beyond not only 4, but 5 planetary boundaries. So it's climate change, the destruction of wild habitats, loss of biodiversity, nitrogen and phosphorus pollution, and now the latest planetary boundary that has been quantified, new chemicals and other novel entities. So that's the first observation. You're all familiar with that, of course. The second observation that I would like to put on the table is that it seems and it looks increasingly clear that the world has not been able to bounce back from the COVID pandemic in a way that contributes to climate stability or biosphere stewardship nor social equity. So as we're seeing very clearly that the pandemic has increased inequality all around the world, and the economic recovery has not led to investments that have been beneficial for people and planet. So clearly, we could have done better, but we have not. And then the third observation, and this is what brings us together today, is the fact that we need a step change increase in ambitions from all sectors in society if we are to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. I think that has become very, very clear. And the 2nd and 3rd of June this year, Stockholm Plus 50 will be held in Stockholm, Sweden. So this meeting will not only commemorate the 1972 United Nations Conference on the Environment and celebrate 50 years of global environmental action, but I think more importantly, and that's the ambition, is that Stockholm Plus 50 is an opportunity for the world to accelerate action towards sustainability. And this seminar that you're joining today is our contribution to this conversation for the planning and conversation ahead of Stockholm Plus 50. We will be hosting several of these online conversations with experts from all over the world on different topics, all related to our changing planet, the economy, and finance. And this particular initiative has been commissioned by the Swedish Ministry of Environment as an independent input and contribution to Stockholm Plus 50. And the work that we're doing, of course, builds on science, and in particular, the Nobel Prize Summit of 2021 that was hosted by the Nobel Foundation. So if you want to know more, I mean, there's much more to know about the Stockholm Plus 50 and this initiative. David, if you can go to the slide with the links, I recommend that you look at the official Stockholm Plus 50 webpage. And you can also see on our webpage at the Beijer Institute, where we have started to list the events that we're hosting ahead of Stockholm Plus 50. So I will not go through the program now because I want to hand over to Pedro for some opening remarks as well before we kick off the conversations.
Thank you, Victor. It's really a pleasure to co-host this seminar with you, which I see really as a continuation of our ongoing collaboration, which was instrumental in shaping the 2020 Human Development Report. But that was really just the beginning of an ongoing collaboration, and we are excited to contribute to the preparations of Stockholm Plus 50. Just a few comments. I think that we know that the pricing of financial assets or economic assets more broadly is not aligned with our understanding of what are financial, economic, and also human development prospects going forward, based on our current ways of organizing our economies and our societies. And we also know that while this misalignment in prices persists, we are sending the wrong signals on where to invest, on what to produce, and what to consume. I think that two of the main challenges in that misalignment in prices have to do with the kind of risks that we are considering when we estimate risk-adjusted returns, and also the neglect of value of assets in the natural world. The discussion today will focus primarily on the risk dimension. And I think it's important to acknowledge that much progress has been made around the incorporation of risks associated with climate change, which is now part of the conversation, including by central banks, not only by fiscal authorities. In the financial world, many private firms are also looking at climate. It's a priority for many investors. But as you mentioned, Victor, I think climate change is really part or a manifestation of a broader set of challenges associated with dangerous planetary change, including perhaps the increase in the frequency of zoonotic diseases, of which COVID-19 may be just the latest example. So this dangerous planetary change is driven by pressures that we are putting on planetary pressures or processes. And I think this represents a new angle that takes us beyond a long-standing concerns with environmental degradation and sustainability. I think this realization that is often associated with the term Anthropocene brings about a new focus of reflections characterized also, these new realities characterized also by inequalities that are linked to gaps in consumption and in power between those that account for the larger contributions to planetary pressures and those bearing the negative consequences of those changes. So I look forward to learning from the presentations and discussions today, which will invite us to take on the implications of this broader set of Anthropocene risks. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, the event today is really part of an ongoing and continuing conversation, which will hopefully take place in the lead up to Stockholm +50 and beyond. And again, I want to emphasize the importance of increasing a sense of urgency and awareness about the need to act, particularly in correcting these price misalignments that I alluded to. So thank you, Victor. Thank you, everyone. And back to you, Victor.
Thank you so much, Pedro. I thought before we begin, just to go through the program just briefly and introduce the speakers a little bit. So if we can get that slide with the first panel. So we have one part, and this is where we will start now, to set the stage a little bit. So Pedro, you mentioned the Anthropocene. So the question is, what is the Anthropocene, and what does it mean that the Anthropocene is creating new risks for human development and finance? And to do that, we have Dr. Patrick Keyes from Colorado State University, who will give a little bit of an introduction to the concept that Anthropocene risks. And that presentation will be followed by Dr. Ann-Sophie Crépin from the Beijer Institute of Ecological Economics, who will explore what she and colleagues have called Biosphere economics, which also builds a little bit on this notion of the Anthropocene, and followed by some comments and reflections from Rafael del Villar Alrich, who's the chief advisor to the governor at Banco de Mexico, to give us some insights from concrete policymaking. And after that, there will be time for questions and comments from you in the audience. And you can use the chat box, or you can raise your hand. If you raise your hand, I might invite you to ask the question directly. And in that case, I will ask you to just briefly introduce yourselves and turn your camera on and ask your questions to the panelists. After that, we'll have a short break and go into part 2 that will assess a little bit, considering where we are at the moment and these new Anthropocene risk, where are we now? And that session will open up with a reflection from Professor Projo Negoro from the University of Indonesia. And he has also been the finance minister of Indonesia between 2014 and 2016. So thank you so much for joining. That will be followed by an intervention from Dr. Angling Kusumo from Bank of Indonesia. And I guess we will hear a little bit more about the presidency in the G20 by Indonesia. And that we will have a final prepared presentation from Dr. Zhang, who's the Chief of Statistics at the UNDP Human Development Report Office on metrics and the need for new metrics and how those have been picked up around the world. And of course, for both these parts, there is time for questions. So put the questions in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll try to organize this a little bit more as a roundtable conversation rather than just a one-way communication seminar. So that's from me, and let's dive deep into part 1. So Patrick Keyes, welcome. If you would like to start this with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Victor, and thanks everyone for attending today. My name is Pat Keyes, and I'm lead scientist at the School of Global Environmental Sustainability at Colorado State University. And I'm going to touch on a couple different points here briefly this morning. Well, morning for me, afternoon, evening for everyone else. And you can go to the next slide. And so before we pick up too much steam, I thought it would be useful to sort of orient everyone in thinking about, well, what is this word that we're throwing around, the Anthropocene? And it has a lot of names, and this is just a few of them. Each of them sort of permits or privileges a view on relevant topics. So if we take the Capitalocene, it talks about unequal accumulation of wealth around the world. We could think about the Homogenocene. This is a way of thinking about the extensive transformation of the ecological system of the world. All of these permits a sense of what's happening. Next slide. But what they all sort of speak to is the accelerating change taking place around the planet in a great number of sectors. This includes social dimensions in orange. It includes ecological or environmental dimensions in blue. And this is a problem, especially for those of you out there that are thinking about problems from a perspective of systems, when we see these interacting nonlinear changes. And that's what this is. Next slide. And so that's why myself and these colleagues developed this concept of Anthropocene risk, where we tried to build on a lot of kind of intellectual capital existing already and think about, what does all this change mean? What could this mean for the future and how we perceive of risk in the future? And I want to add that that paper might be difficult to access for some, so just send me a note if you're trying to get it and I can pass it along. But this is our quick definition. What are Anthropocene risks? They originate from anthropogenic changes in key functions of the Earth system. They emerge due to the evolution of globally intertwined social and ecological systems. Things are coupled together more densely and in surprising and unexpected ways. And they exhibit complex cross-scale interactions that ranges from local to global and short-term to deep time. And just to pause briefly here, we could contrast this against, say, the World Economic Forum's perspective on, say, global risk, which takes a broader view in some ways of thinking about countries or industries that might experience a negative outcome, but over a shorter time horizon, in their case, 10 years. And so in some ways, it's not so fruitful to say which one is the best, which one is the most useful, and to think, well, which are these uniquely contributing? What intellectual advancement are these different ideas contributing? Because that can help us to see things that we weren't paying attention to. Next slide, please. So, for example, we're sort of living amidst an Anthropocene crisis, you could say. That's a wet market on the left-hand side, and that could be any wet market in the world. This one happens to be in Shenzhen, China, and it's an opportunity. Those locations are opportunities for zoonotic illnesses to jump, and it turns out that those illnesses can jump in a matter of days. And in a matter of a few short weeks, they can clear out grocery store shelves. And we've seen this, we've experienced this for the last 2 years. So it's probably not appropriate to call this one an Anthropocene risk, it's a crisis now. But what about COVID-28? What about COVID-32? These are very likely, especially given those accelerating trends and changes in our world. And so those would be Anthropocene risks, and we should treat them accordingly. Next slide, please. So what sort of development ought we to target in the Anthropocene? What should we even be thinking about amidst this backdrop of accelerating change? We don't have anything approaching a normal baseline by which to compare. Next slide. What we need is development that satisfies human needs without transgressing boundaries. Victor earlier mentioned the planetary boundaries. This is a set of 9 interconnected measures of the Earth system, beyond which we really don't want to go. We don't know what will happen to the Earth system if we transgress some of these Earth system scale boundaries. At the same time, we have to lift society to a just foundation of access to basic well-being. So we have this green sweet spot, this donut of safe and just operating space for humanity. Next slide. The problem is we don't have any examples where development has taken us in a direction that permits a safe development. This is a graph by Dan O'Neill and colleagues where they've looked at transgression of boundaries on the x-axis and social development on the y. Next slide. And the long story short is that there are no examples of human development that has not transgressed boundaries across the board. Next slide. We need to bend that curve, and we need to go in a completely different direction. And we don't have good examples for this, and we need them. Next slide. So what can we do? We need to find ways for the system to become less efficient at transgressing boundaries. Where are these places where we can become less efficient at transgressing planetary boundaries, more efficient at achieving the social thresholds? And how can we steer rich and powerful systems toward lifestyles that permit everyone else to achieve the social foundation? Next slide. That's it. So final thoughts. Mitigation of Anthropocene risks requires systemic changes to our ways of life. We need to redefine what constitutes a good life across the board, but especially in the rich world. We need to identify development that slows down the transgression of biophysical boundaries, and we need to use finance to steer the deployment of capital to work toward convergence on low impact lifestyles. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Patrick. That was a very good introduction. And again, I welcome people to ask questions, use the chat or raise your hands. But I think I'm going to let, while you think about what questions you would like to ask, I'm going to invite Ann-Sophie to continue on sort of the similar conversation that Patrick got started with, a little bit more of emphasis on the economy and economic thinking. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Ann-Sophie.
Thank you, Victor. Could you please put up my slides on the screen? I don't see my, here. So thank you, Victor, and for inviting me to this presentation and panel discussion. So next slide. So what is biosphere economics? It's basically the acknowledging the understanding that the economy is an intertwined part of society, which is an intertwined part of the biosphere, and all these 3 different parts are interacting with each other in a very complex way. And in the Anthropocene, what has happened is that the economy and the society have taken a much more important proportion compared to the biosphere, which has not changed its size. So these changes in proportion has implied changes in the dynamics between economy, society, and the biosphere, but also within each of these different aspects. And that is what we try to study with biosphere economics. So it implies the accounting for scale, speed, and connectivity of these intertwined interactions between the social and the ecological system. Next slide. So I often get the question, so should we throw out all the economic theory and start anew? And I would say no, actually, we have very good tools to address that. The problem is we've been asking the wrong questions all the time. So we need to ask questions not too much about how will we build our house, how will we build our economy, but how can we build our economy within the biosphere so that it can strive and both of them can strive. So again, it's about focusing on interactions across time, space, and scale, which may trigger abrupt change if they're not monitored properly. It's about focusing on feedback loops because some of them may be reinforcing the current dynamics or dampening the current dynamics, which also could lead to abrupt change in the system. And we want to focus on tipping point thresholds and the Anthropocene risk that Patrick was mentioning before. So next slide. So I also get the question, so what are the common misunderstandings amongst policymakers that why don't they act in the right way? And often they say, well, because we need to know more before we act. But yes, sometimes you need to know more, but in many situations, you actually know enough before we can act. So sometimes we just need enough information to actually be able to take action. So for example, many investments in the environment, like investing in energy efficiency or limiting air pollution, are investments that are already they're paid for themselves. You don't need to identify all the benefits that they make for the environment, which are more difficult to quantify. You just need to go and do it, and it will bear its own cost already. Often we also have a lot of existing knowledge. The problem is we haven't put it together. So putting it together into system picture can give a clarity needed to take action. And sometimes you need to take a step back. So next slide. So if you want to understand what this picture shows, perhaps zooming in on the details, next slide, is not going to give you an answer. You should take a step back, next slide, to see that this actually represents a thorough picture. And in real life, that's also the case. We often want to study more details, and then we should instead step back to see what is the system picture telling us and showing us. Next slide. Finally, I want to show you an example of what you can achieve with a system perspective. So this is an example of an article by my colleagues who took a system perspective to identify what are the effects of a climate tax on the 9 planetary boundaries that Patrick and Victor have mentioned before. And they showed that if you look at the effect of a climate tax only, you see that not only they are positive for the climate change boundary, but also for biodiversity, phosphorus, nitrogen, ocean acidification. But they are not so positive for land system change and for freshwater use. But if you instead look at what happens if you put the climate tax and also take away all the subsidies to fossil fuel, well, using that system perspective, they actually can show that you would improve all the boundaries in a row. So that was the final word, trying to illustrate how this system perspective actually can help us improve and find easy solution, or at least not so complex solution that we think. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ann-Sophie. I think before I invite our next speaker, I have one question to both of you, both Ann-Sophie and Pat, that might be a little bit provocative, but this is just to get the discussions going. So I think of what you presented here, what is really new compared to what we knew 3 decades ago, or 4 decades ago, or maybe even 1972 in the Stockholm conference? So Pat, I mean, what you're talking about is essentially that we live in a globalized world where shocks move quickly across boundaries. Didn't we know that already? And for Ann-Sophie, essentially you're saying that there are some economic tools that we can use that would have multiple synergies. I'm thinking and suspecting that economics, and especially ecological economics or environmental economics, has made quite some progress in the last decades, and that we understand things now that we didn't understand a couple of decades ago. What is that? Because we need to know that when we meet in Stockholm for Stockholm Plus 50 to accelerate what we're trying to achieve here. Who wants to go first?
Perhaps Pat should go first.
Okay, that's fine. So to me, I think the easy answer is that this is a sort of a reinforcement of things that were forecast, that were projected in the 70s. We are in a position globally where many groups actually thought we might be in the context of exceeding a lot of the limits, social, ecological, planetary. And I think, sadly, it's a little bit of a confirmation of some of those projections at that time. And so I think that it shouldn't come as any surprise we are where we are to some people, because we haven't changed very much. And I think that one thing that we can now definitively say is that the path that we're on is absolutely the wrong path. There's no question. And perhaps at the time there was some lack of clarity around that in terms of our the process of industrial development, what types of goals the global economy is seeking at a collective and an individual basis. And so now I think there's no question from the perspective of the Anthropocene risk, from the perspective of economic impact, from the perspective of planetary boundaries, from the perspective of inequality and power differentials, that we're on the wrong path. And so, okay, we know that now. How can we use the insights from the past 50 years to define an altogether different path? And so we do need new insights, sort of a call to action to identify trajectories that permit a safer path forward.
Thanks, Pat. Ann-Sophie.
Yes, we have a lot to build on, and there has been a lot of development in economic theory. You mentioned ecological economics that have been working in that direction for many, many years. So what is new, or actually it's not totally new, but what we more and more realize is that, well, we need to take into account these Anthropocene risks, and the only way to do that in a proper way, because we can't look at the past, because this situation we're in now hasn't happened before. So the only way to address that properly is to ask the right question, to look at the system and study it with the tools we have. And the tools of economics are quite useful to study systems. The problem is we haven't asked the right questions. So what are the right questions? So some of the right question is, what are the slow variables? What are things changing slowly that may totally change the situation if they hit the thresholds that are around there? What are the things? What are the interaction between parts of the system that are very far away, that happen indirectly, that we will not see if we just don't look at the system? We just look at the immediate interactions, we won't see them. So we really need to get a big system picture to understand why climate influences biodiversity, which influences production of certain natural resources, which influences. So we have long chains of interaction like that we need to understand better, and that we haven't looked much in economic before. That's what we can do with the system perspective. And we need to keep our eyes on possible thresholds that we may pass, and that we can do by more scientific knowledge, but also by looking at these slow variables and these complex interactions that may help us identify where the thresholds are or might be.
Okay, thank you, Ann-Sophie. I mean, I hear some very familiar terms here that we all, of course, think are important, right? So complex systems, connections and tipping points and thresholds, etc. That are all very important. I think I'm going to invite Rafael del Villar Alrich to share some reflections as well from your point of view. I mean, you're much more involved into actual policymaking, economic policymaking, as I understand it. So please.
Thank you very much, Victor. And thank you really, Pedro, to you also for the invitation to be with you today. Within the institutional architecture of a state, a central bank has a very clear and restricted mandate: price and financial stability. Within the network for greening the financial system, this is a central banks and supervisors network founded at the end of 2017. And also within the G20 finance track group that is today called the Sustainable Finance Working Group. And other, I just want to throw these names out because they are very important. The Financial Stability Board, the Basel Committee on Financial Supervision. We have an incredibly unanimous picture coming out of that. Even though this is a very complex, climate change, for instance, is a financial risk. And since banks have this price and financial stability mandate, they have to deal with these risks, being them financial. And I have to go back to what Pedro just mentioned at the introduction, that the pricing of economic assets are not not aligned, are misaligned, and this sends the wrong signals. I think this is these are all important things, because once we realize that this phenomena that we are talking, which are of course financial risks, it's too obvious to say, but it has to be repeated. That it comes into the realm of this financial policy making, Victor, that you were talking about. So I think, it comes in different. We have to look at it from different perspectives, because from an internal central bank perspective, this means that we have to upgrade our models for not only physical and transition risks, and there is huge effort on being undertaken precisely within the network for greening the financial system on this, so we have. Within this network, the NGFS, we have worked very much in bringing together scientists, sort of, for instance, the Potsdam Institute for Climate, among several other groups, in understanding and using their models, and bringing them together with economic and financial modeling, and so land use and models and energy models and transport models are being connected with precisely macroeconomic models that are more standard, but that are capable of linking this physical and transition risks. I want to stress that coming from an emerging market, it's important to realize that when we look at, say, physical risks, we have say over 100 models out there. I mean, 100 is just a number. I mean, there is a vast number of models looking at different physical risks issues, and physical risks are talking about inequality are going to impact very much the countries in the lower latitudes. So this is significant because, for instance, in comparison to physical risks, what we have as to transition risks, we have essentially three models, no? Three well-developed models to analyze transition risks. But in physical risk, we have so many options, so that it's a daunting task for financial policy makers in the lower latitudes to really assess fully these physical risks. And I'm not even talking about the whole planetary boundaries. No, I mean the other complexities that are there. No, so it's just on the physical risks is so many, and it's so granular, the physical risk. No, you need to have this precise geolocation of the asset to understand what is the potential implication of climate change risks are. So it's a pretty complex task. Just to finish, I want to stress go back to the market dynamics that we see, namely the fact that investors globally are playing an incredibly important role in affecting transformation. And the reason being is that precisely, say, if you think of a pension fund, typically a long-term fund, you of course realize that these guys have to really internalize these risks into their decision making. They cannot simply say, well, I mean, this is a long-term risk, and therefore it's not really within our horizon. No, they have to really start internalizing these risks, and so it's been from 5 years till now, it's such a dramatic change in terms of the commitment of asset managers globally to start addressing so-called ESG risks, which is, of course, not yet a fully developed science. Every ESG rating service provider has different methodologies, and the methodologies are not in any way fully consistent between them. So, but the point I'm trying to make is that heavy interest in developing these methodologies is being placed, and lots of resources are being made, and this means that financial markets are starting to move, and when they start to move, they move unpredictably at different speeds. And one thing we may observe is that precisely when we look, say, at high intensity carbon assets, that we may end up having a situation in which these assets may seem that they are misaligned, but then the speed at which they are going to get aligned is moving very fast. And this is, of course, this is a huge risk also for emerging markets. So we are in, to conclude, for a particularly rough ride in the coming years. Thank you, Victor.
Thank you so much. I mean, that was fascinating reflection. I'm opening up the floor for questions from the audience, but before I let anyone more in, Rafael, I just wanted to ask you, I think it's fascinating to hear, and it is early days, that all these models exist and that you're updating them now. But I'm also curious to hear, what is the response from governments to this initiative? And will more information and better models also change government policies, economic policies, or is it just within financial markets that you will see this change?
I really thank you for this question, Victor. I think it's a wonderful question, because that gives me an opportunity to stress a very important point that I had omitted, with the fact that central banks having a clout of being a serious entity within the countries. No, it's not any other entity within the country. Central banks have sort of a cloud saying around them, you know, these guys are serious. They do serious research. And this credibility is extremely important because from credibility stems awareness, and from awareness, you know, brings in dialogue with central governments. And you know, the path is not always smooth and, you know, easy, and, you know, we see that all the time, that there tends to be some tension between central banks and governments, and you know, in different directions. But I think it's important to realize that this conversation requires a lot of awareness creation on the part of governments themselves, which are not many times aware of these implications, these long-term implications that perhaps central banks are better positioned to address, no, to look at.
Thank you. I mean, that's spot on, and I think it's really fascinating to hear that interplay between economics and policy, and how that changes things. And so I'm going to open up for the audience. If you have any questions, just put them in the chat or raise your hands. If we have anyone, I'm waiting for any wise questions. Also, welcome to Patrick and Ann-Sophie. If you have any questions to Rafael or the other way around, that would be good. Okay, thank you. Ann-Sophie, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm not sure it's a wise question, but at least it is a question to Rafael mostly about all these models that you are talking, and that's a complex situation. I'm wondering to what extent are people trying to link these models together and try to make them simpler to see the whole picture rather than looking into the details, which I'm not sure is the right way to do.
Shall I go out?
Yes, yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Ann-Sophie. It's yes. We economists, we do not understand complex systems. So let's be very humble here. We have no clue in complex systems. So when at the NGFS we have been working with different models. You know, the focus has been on climate and climate change, and not so much on the, you know, we haven't really gone out to security issues, to health issues. I mean, it's too complicated. I mean, we are not in any way close to being there. No, I mean, it's and when we're talking about a climate, you know, well, we have different models, and to be clear, much of the focus has been gone into transition risks, not so much into physical risks. And you may realize that has to do with what I said before about the 100+ models, you know, and and its complexity of looking at the granular data and stuff with physical risks. But that is a little bit unfortunate, Ann-Sophie. Well, before I go to this point about being unfortunate, as to the simplicity that I wanted to answer is the fact that these models, you know, there is a key variable out there in these models, which is the opportunity cost of carbon. So so you have these very complex models, but then at the end you have one variable, which is the opportunity cost of carbon, no? And that explains a lot, you know. And so when you have, say, a delayed transition, well, what happens with a delayed transition? you have a shooting up of the carbon price, no, and then you sort of think through how the economy will adjust to this carbon price, and we have not yet in any way really thought through how politically complex such a carbon shooting of would be, no, in any way. So it's a very sort of still early conversation. Ann-Sophie.
Thank you so much. That was a good question, and thanks for elaborating a good answer. I'm going to invite Katie Kedward from University College London. I know you've done quite interesting and exciting work in this space as well. Please ask your question.
Thanks very much, Victor, and thank you to the three panelists for excellent presentations. It was really great to get that introduction to this fantastic session. My question is for Rafael. Actually, I thought you gave a really great overview of the excellent progress that's been made by financial policymakers, in particular central banks and financial supervisors, in developing new methodologies for climate. And of course, they're now kind of extending their attention to biodiversity and broader environmental threats. But I wanted to kind of explore a tension that might be at play between the quantification focus of the existing initiatives outlined by Rafael, which focus on the development of new methodologies for modelling risks and understanding how to create disclosure frameworks and taxonomies, and the fact that many of the ecological phenomena we're talking about are fundamentally unpredictable, such as tipping points and rapid regime shifts, the non-linearities associated with feedback loops, etc. So my question is, to what extent is there a temporal trade-off between the time that's needed to develop these new methodologies to deal with these ecological complexities, and the fact that actually many of these Anthropocene risks may emerge and become material in the near term or in the short to medium term, before these sorts of methodologies can be finalized and operationalized? And the follow-on question from that is, what sorts of actions can financial policymakers and other policymakers take more immediately based on the scientific consensus about the level of threat that we know today? Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Just very briefly, what we do is we partner with scientists that know what they are talking about, Katie. No, so tipping points. I mean, it's very hard for economic financial modeling of tipping points. We have so many examples like this Arctic permafrost meltdown. Whatever. So the short answer is yes. Our models are, based in a business as usual sort of scenario. All models are based on a business as usual scenario in which we actually do not fully incorporate, the effects of tipping points, because there is so big, because we are in the realm of uncertainty here. No, so we don't know. We don't know if the global warming that is occurring, and we rely on scientists for that, is already we have already transgressed some fundamental tipping point. And from news in different places, we hear all the time that there are some alarming information coming out, but the only thing we can do is to partner with scientists.
Good, thank you so much. I'm going to invite. We have some questions in the chat as well. I will jump onto those as well, but I think I want to invite Karin Svensson first from the Swedish International Development Agency, SIDA, if you want to ask your questions, Karin.
Thank you so much. So I'm Karin Svensson. I'm SIDA's project manager for Global Investors for Sustainable Development. It's a UN.
I think we lost the sound there, right? From Karin. Yeah. We lost connection. Karin, with you? We can't hear you. No. Okay. So Karin, we'll invite you back soon. I think, Patrick, there's a question for you in the Q&A from Mary Ruckelhaus. I don't know whether you see it. And the question is, are there examples of engagement or discussion processes from communities to regions to global bodies that are beginning to discuss alternative futures to avoid Anthropocene risks? So are the examples of next steps that could be taken to bend the curve? Have you heard of those, Patrick, that you could share with Mary from the
Thank you, Mary. Can you hear me? Is this good? So short answer is yes. There are lots of groups that are tackling this from different perspectives. Some of them include qualitative approaches that are actually using sort of systematic visioning exercises, futures exercises to envision alternative possibilities, alternative futures out there. I'm thinking of the Seeds of the Good Anthropocene project that's been led by a lot of people. I shouldn't say led, but there are lots of people involved, including Laura Pereira in South Africa and others, Elena Bennett, Carrie Peterson. And so that's a good place to look in terms of the qualitative dimension, but there's also people that are actually trying to do the modeling work, thinking about what are the alternative economic arrangements that could actually permit charting a different course. So looking at circular economics, restorative economics, these are options that are on the table. They aren't particularly, they're not as consistent with the kind of current systems that we have in place, economic systems, particularly a lot of the kind of explicit orientation on accumulation of capital versus maybe not the accumulation of capital. And anything that's not really about profit and accumulation of wealth is sort of antithetical in some ways. And so, but that doesn't mean that those ideas aren't out there and being actively discussed. And so I think that there is opportunity there to expand those discussions, especially in this time where there's sort of a global conversation to deepen that discussion and think about what are some ways that we could thoughtfully push some of those ideas forward. I hope that helps.
Thanks a lot, Patrick. Maybe you can put the link to the Seeds of a Good Anthropocene project on the chat for people who want to see that. Pedro, I see your hand is up and you have a question.
Yes, Victor, thank you. I want to pick up on this important point that Rafael mentioned, which is the distinction between physical hazards, risks, and transition risks, which I think was a useful contribution of the network for greening the financial system. So my question perhaps to Pat and then Sophie is whether you think that this framing or the separation between physical hazards and the risks associated with physical hazards and transition is something that could be a frame to help us beyond climate, because this is used primarily in the context of climate, to the Anthropocene reality. And to Rafael, whether you see any appetite and interest in the community of central banks to start incorporating other drivers of dangerous planetary change beyond climate change. You mentioned biodiversity, but if there's an appetite and an interest to take a broader view of these Anthropocene risks. Thank you.
So let's start Pat or Ann-Sophie and then maybe Rafael after that.
Perhaps I can start. I think many of these risks are connected. So just looking at climate risk, you will miss both impacts on the other dimensions of the Anthropocene and also possible impacts on the climate by things that are happening in other dimensions of the Anthropocene. So I think it's important to first of all acknowledge these systemic connections, and as long as we don't do that, we're not going to move forward. So it's not like we can do this in 50 years from now when we have more knowledge. We need to start there, because we're not going anywhere if we don't start there. So any risk concept linked to systemic risks that will help us move forward. And it's my word would be, it's not that complicated as you think it should be, because it helps you focus on the most important thing and not on details that are turn out to not be that important in the end.
Thank you. Patrick, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I suppose that in the context of transitional risks, I think there's a question, and I'm not sure how this plugs into it completely, but assumptions about what's on the other side of those risks. And I think that in the context of the Anthropocene risk or other framings, we all have assumptions baked into our decision-making processes. Our you could think of it as a Bayesian decision network, whatever decision network you have. If you have assumptions about what the world is going to look like on the other side, I think that's one of those things where we have to question those assumptions, because the Anthropocene tosses all of those assumptions out the window in many ways, especially things that are 20, 30 years ahead of us. That doesn't mean we can't try and explore those ideas and what might be on the other side. But I think a lot of these risks, particularly those thinking about kind of short-term gains or losses, are going to be upended when we realize that the baseline by which we're evaluating some of those risks is actually not a very good baseline in the first place.
So, I mean, to me, that sounds like a strong call to build general resilience. Let's see. I mean, Rafael, there was one question for you, so maybe you would like to respond to that. And after that, I want to invite Ellie Sepkidu to ask her question, if that's okay. So, Rafael.
Yes, Victor, thank you. Thank you, Pedro, for the question. Yes, when we started the NGFS, we said it was a network for greening the financial system. So not for climate only, no, and that is because, of course, we were 8 founders of the network, and Banco de Mexico in particular was not only, and the Bank of China were not only interested in looking at climate issues alone and isolated, but we were very much interested in having a more encompassing menu. So biodiversity, for instance, there is already important research going on at the biodiversity sphere, and we haven't gone into other human sort of social issues yet, no. But that goes without saying, because it's very clear from the pandemic that the risks are very much related, no? Biodiversity loss or degradation, biodiversity degradation is very much has to do a lot with the destabilizing systems in even health systems, and it's also very clear that biodiversity loss has a lot to do, and loss of natural capital has a lot to do with migration, and so the connections are popping up. It's just that in terms of modeling, what I wanted to stress is that the modeling effort that I was referring to at the beginning is a huge modeling effort, and that bringing in to the conversations, as I said, scientists and financial modelers, and it's people. So bringing in people that have not in previously talked to each other extensively, no, and now we're sort of trying to bring people that speak different languages together, and of course there is some translation problems.
That's a very good observation. So Ellie, I'm gonna let you ask the last question before we take a short break.
Thank you. So so my name is Ellie Sepkidu. I'm leading the research at the Financial System Benchmark at the World Benchmarking Alliance, and we're looking to benchmark 400 of the most influential financial institutions on issues such as climate change, biodiversity, and human rights. So thank you very much for the presentations. I thought they were very, very interesting. Pat, I really like your comment about COVID-32. I'm just recovering from COVID, many numbers back, so just the 19. But I thought, for sure we are not building back better. It seems that everyone just went back to business as usual, but actually worse. So I had many thoughts during the presentations, and I thought it stimulated my mind what you said, Victor, about what has changed in the last 30 or 50 years. So I suppose, for me personally, what has changed is the urgency, and hearing the discussion today. I'm just wondering whether while we're busy trying to figure out exactly the risk model and exactly how to price the assets accurately, whether our house is burning, and maybe we could focus more on an approach which would be about impact considerations and impact management from our financial system and from our financial institutions overall. So not just about climate change, taking it much forward and much wider, about what is the impact of our financial institutions on the planet, on people, on biodiversity, on human rights, on social rights, and are they fit for purpose? Is our financial architecture even fit for purpose, given the urgency of the issues that we are facing today? So I would really like to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
That's a big and important question. I think that's more for you, Rafael, right? So what's the sense within your colleagues from central banks? Are they asking this very tough question, whether the financial system is fit for purpose?
Well, it's not. So that's very clear, very short answer, no. But however, there is much hope, Ellie. Look at the International Sustainability Standards Board that was launched during the COP26 with two running prototypes, starting with climate. Imagine now let's going back to the word hope. Imagine that they stick to what they announced, that by the end of this year, they will have a climate standard in place. And then continue imagining that the next year and the years follow on, several countries, starting with Europe, but also emerging countries like Mexico, start to adopt, to bring into their national legislation these standards. And that firms are suddenly required to assess these climate issues, and they are only starting with climate. They are going to continue with sustainability. It's an International Sustainability Standards Board. So just imagine that these guys, this has seismic effects on the real sector, not only the financial sector, because these accounting standards are going to change the DNA of firms. It's not only nice to have, no. It's like, oh, we are green, we are we have this social responsibility report, and we put in whatever we like into that report. No. This is going to become serious accounting practice. And I'm an optimist, Ellie. No, so if we think about it in that terms, I think serious change is going to start happening, because firms will have to start measuring many things that they are not measuring today.
Thank you. That's a very good observation and a good wrap up for this first part. So we're going to take a 5-minute break now. So 5-minute break, grab a cup of coffee or tea or water, and welcome back to the second part, where we will dive a little bit deeper into all these issues with 3 other excellent panelists. So see you in 5 minutes. Okay, let's start with the second part. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you managed to get a little bit of a leg stretch and break. We're going to start with the second part of this conversation. And first up, we have Professor Bronjonegoro from the University of Indonesia. Welcome. We're looking forward to hear your reflections on the topics that we have been discussing in the first panel about the economy and finance in this new Anthropocene era, and also ahead of Stockholm +50. So, Professor, thank you for joining us and welcome. The stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Victor. Distinguished panelists, participants, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, on behalf of the T20 or T20 Indonesia, I would like to thank for the opportunity to be part of this Stockholm +50 conversation. So this year, for us, for everybody actually, will be a crucial year in terms of recovery. Hopefully, of course, from pandemic, and also we can start mitigating the climate change. Indonesia will host the G20 this year. I mean, we already hosting the G20 this year, and also chosen as the chair of ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, next year, giving the ASEAN region as a whole the chance to push topics that will help the global economic recovery continue toward a more fair global financial system and net zero economic transition to advance sustainable development. Despite our significant commitment to address climate change, ASEAN and its member states, and let me tell you why we use ASEAN, not only Indonesia, because altogether ASEAN is the fourth biggest economy in Asia after China, India, Japan. I mean, China, Japan, India, and ASEAN, even altogether above South Korea. So despite our commitment to address climate change, the ASEAN members are among, unfortunately, the fastest growing in the world, caused by, fastest growing emission in the world, caused by population growth, rising income levels, and subsequent development gains. Deforestation, peatland degradation, and agriculture activities such as rice farming all contribute significantly to agriculture, forestry, and other land use, or we used to call EVOLU, emissions in the ASEAN area. The region's forests have shifted from being a net sink to a source of emission during the last 2 decades, releasing over 500 million tons of CO2 every year, CO2 equivalent every year. The risk of postponing action on climate change far outweigh any imagined benefits. Climate change-related economic losses might be 60% more than originally projected, lowering our GDP by 11% in 2100, or as much as 37.4%. Meeting the Paris Agreement objective of stabilizing global temperature at far below 2 degrees centigrade, on the other hand, will only have 0.8% negative impact on the region's GDP. So, ASEAN has a unique window of opportunity to build on its commitment to sustainable development by transforming its socio-economic model into one that focuses on social, environmental, and economic sustainability as domestic and international financing increasingly shifts toward sustainable and low-carbon modes of economic development. There has been significant progress on disclosing the risks that climate change poses for financial return. A growing number of central banks, including our central bank represented by Pak Reza here, financial institutions and also investors are attempting to better understand and emphasize the economic and financial impact of climate-related financial risks. For example, we already launched the roadmap to sustainable finance by our Financial Services Authority of Indonesia. However, achieving sustainable development will not happen without a significant international support. Developed nations should take the lead in decreasing emissions and providing funding, technology, and capacity development to developing nations to aid in climate mitigation and adaptation. COP21 in Glasgow result also urged developed nations to increase their financial contribution with specific plan in place to meet $100 billion climate financial contribution per year. Apart from international contribution, private capital should be leveraged for green investment. Mainstream private funding is especially important in assisting businesses to realign their business model to achieve net zero emissions. Local initiatives such as marine protected areas should also be encouraged, as it may lead to improvement in economic equality, equality in access and governance, as well as providing health and environmental benefits to improve quality of life. I think that will be my introductory remarks, and of course, we'll be happy to discuss more at the Q&A session. Back to you, Victor. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor. I would like to invite Dr. Piesa Angli Kusumo just directly, just to continue this conversation about Indonesia and the regions from Bank of Indonesia. So if you would like to take the next. Thank you.
Novi, would you kindly, okay. Pak Bambang, izin Pak.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Victor. Hello, everyone. I'm honored and delighted to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you all. I've been asked to provide my initial reflections in the context of Indonesia G20 presidency, which I will approach from the perspective of sustainable finance, hence the title of my presentation today. In the interest of time, let me start. In the last decade, increasing awareness of the Anthropocene risks has led to systematic changes in the world of finance. One notable instance is the increasing preference in the global capital markets towards sustainable finance. Sustainable finance can be broadly defined as the incorporation of risks and opportunities pertaining to the environment, social and governance, or ESG issues into business and financial valuation. A key driver behind this so-called ESG integration in finance is the changing stakeholders' expectations, particularly those of the consumers and investors. For the investors, the growing activism of global consumers with regards to ESG issues has altered the materiality of risk and return on finance on investment in a business, a company, or a project. Investors will go the extra miles in assessing the financial materiality of ESG issues so as to avoid having to deal with stranded assets in the long run. So ESG integrations into business and finance seems to be the rising norm nowadays. Several important trends with regards to ESG integrations are worth mentioning. First is the sizable increase in capital mobilization. A notable instance is the recent pledge by financial institutions under the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero during the COP26 in 21. The next step is to ensure the integrity of these pledges, particularly through the flow of financing to the developing economies. The second trend is the proliferation of ESG reporting and disclosure frameworks and the use of it. This trend is a welcome development. However, further work is needed to reduce the fragmentation of the existing frameworks. The third trend is the integration of ESG issues into private investing decisions, particularly among major investment firms and asset managers. For developing economies, this serves as an opportunity on the sell side. This opportunity can be fully exploited if domestic market for sustainable finance is developed and feasible climate-related projects and business opportunities for the buy side to consider are mobilized. The question now is, what can governments do to expedite capital reallocation for sustainable finance by private institutions? As a global common platform for advancing the market for sustainable finance, we already have the G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap adopted in 2021, with 5 focus areas. The Indonesia presidency of G20 in 2022 is expected to continue the implementations of the roadmap around these 5 key areas. Given the trends and remaining challenges I've mentioned, Focus Area 1, Market Development for Faster Capital Reallocation, and Focus Area 2, Comparable Market Information are key areas which may yield strong reform benefits. In the near future, as mentioned by Rafael earlier, we expect the International Sustainability Standards Board to deliver a comprehensive global baseline of sustainability related disclosure standards for review and endorsement by International Organizations of Security Commissions, or the IOSCO. If endorsed, the implementation of these key global public goods in various jurisdictions can be expected to lower the fragmentation of standards in the market and hence foster global capital reallocation through various channels. But more importantly, for developing economies, managing the transition to sustainable finance necessitates the development of the sell side. Governments, in collaboration with international development institutions, can play a role by ensuring the availability of steady streams of quality domestic ESG projects and business opportunities, and simultaneously developing transition-relevant financial instruments in the domestic financial markets, including market-based government sustainable financing instruments. These two must be diligently pursued in tandem to allow for the domestic financial institutions to smoothly adjust their portfolio and hence keeping the financial system stability intact during the transition. Accordingly, quality economic reforms to expedite the transitions of the real sector towards a green economy must also serve as a complementary part of the overall sustainable finance agenda, or the buy side of the market, to enhance the sell side of the market. The development finance institutions and multilateral development institutions are expected to play important roles to support the development of the sell side through actions in Focus Area 4 of the roadmap. Before I close, let me say a little bit about Indonesia. Through the implementations of Indonesia Climate Governance Framework, Indonesia will contribute to global joint efforts for a sustainable future, like Pak Bambang just mentioned earlier. In the area of sustainable finance intermediation, the Ministry of Finance, Bank Indonesia, and the Indonesia Financial Services Authority, the OJK, we have worked hand in hand in close coordination to gradually realign the domestic financial system and develop the market as well as policy instruments to support Indonesia's national contribution for the reductions of global GHG emissions. On that note, I will end here and return the screen to you, Victor. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. I think I'm going to actually allow a couple of questions here from the audience. If you have something related to G20 or Indonesia, please raise your hand or add them to the chat, because I think I have one question to both of you maybe, and that relates to this roadmap, which looks quite ambitious. I'm curious to hear whether there's something in there about removing or having an overview of harmful subsidies, for example, for whether it's fisheries or fossil fuel extraction or deforestation, etc. Is that at all on the agenda on this roadmap? And where is it? Because to me, it sounds that it's not only about allocating more green capital. To me, it's also about removing some of the capital that is undermining resilience across many dimensions. I'd love to hear your reflections on that from both of you, if possible.
Okay, let me try to answer your question. I was finance minister from 2014 to 2016, and actually in almost at the end of 2014, that was the first time that Indonesia tried to remove totally the fuel subsidy. And at the time it works, and of course, as a result, the price increased. But we, at the time, as a government, what we are trying to do is to shift the subsidy from the commodity base into targeted subsidy, or targeted social assistance, like many advanced countries had been doing until today. And it worked for the first years, 2014, 2015, but at the end, removing fuel subsidy is very much related to the political issue. I think you need to know that the so-called fuel subsidy has been there in Indonesia probably since late 1960s. So it has been there for more than 50 years. So you can imagine that people are still shocked, when suddenly there is no subsidy and the price becomes higher. And although the government trying very hard to shift the subsidy from the commodity base into the targeted subsidy, still this issue of the fuel price becomes a hot political debate. I believe it doesn't happen only in Indonesia. It happens, if I'm trying to follow the news all around the world, it happens in many developing countries that still needs some kind of subsidy in order to reduce the price. So this is the effort that Indonesia has been doing. And now, of course, we still adopt it to some extent, the subsidy, although the number has been relatively very small. But we still have another subsidy, for example, for electricity. And it's simply because the matter of price. And of course, the issue is most of our electricity still generated from the coal or gas, which is still considered as a fossil fuel. So I believe the agenda of the roadmap to sustainable finance will somehow include the removal of fuel subsidy, and probably the most important thing for Indonesia is to change the people mindset. Yes, we will give the subsidy, but instead of giving subsidy to fossil fuel, we need to give subsidy to the renewable energy. And in fact, the so-called subsidy or incentive for renewable energy is still very limited in Indonesia, unlike the subsidy for the fossil fuel. I think that will be my response to your question.
That's good. Thank you very much. Reza, do you have anything to add to that?
Okay, thank you, Victor. First of all, let me say this. We have observed significant changes in the consumer awareness of, we call it Anthropocene risks, or the bigger systemic risk facing our world today. But consumers have become more aware of the existential threats of climate change and how it will affect their daily life and even the future. So this increasing awareness has led to consumers demanding more accountability from producers of goods and services. And this has already affected the investment community, because then if consumers is asking for a better governance or better stewardship of the earth, then producers must adjust. Otherwise, this is what we call transition risk. Otherwise your asset will be stranded assets in the long run. So what investors are now demanding is that companies, start to investees. What I mean, companies that are investees, they have to start to take into account ESG issues, environment, not only environment, but environment and its interlinkages with social issues and governance issues. And when it comes to governance issues, this includes supply chain issues. You can have a product that you argue this is green, but if your supply chain, your suppliers are not green, then actually your product are not that green after all. So investors demand those ESG issues be incorporated in the investees' valuation. So this is a significant change, from a few years back. At least this is in the last decade. We see that increasingly the capital markets, big investors. I echo Rafael when he mentioned that asset management and big investment firms, leading global investment firms, they are all now putting ESG issues as part of their criteria for investment. And this is shown in the network, the Alliance for Climate Finance in the COP26 last year, where the pledges, if I'm not mistaken, is amounted to around 300 trillion US dollar in total. So, now the G20 through this sustainable finance roadmap is trying to ensure that there is a functioning market for capital reallocations, because the money is there and the intention is there. That's why I share the optimism of Rafael that perhaps this is, there are risks, but opportunities are also there, because transition risks involve transition opportunities. Businesses can create long-term value by responding more to their consumers, to the demand of the consumers and also regulators. The G20, through this sustainable finance roadmap, we would like to ensure that there is a functioning market for sustainable finance, for capital reallocations, and also market information, useful market information for investment decisions. This is the focus area 1 and 2 that I mentioned earlier. What Rafael explained today is mostly on focus area 3, which is how policymakers, central banks and regulators mitigate the risk, not only the physical but also the transition risk, including this risk that more and more investors are beginning to value ESG projects more, and some big investment firms are also are already doing that. So we work towards that end, by putting everything together so that to ensure financial intermediation or what as I mentioned, capital reallocation can be aligned to this our aspiration for sustainable future. So it's part market solution, but also governments are doing a lot of reforms and try to implement this sustainable finance.
That's good. Thank you. Well, I think we lost your sound there, Reza, for a little bit. But I think we're going to we have one more question, I think, before we let our last speaker jump in. So Mary Ruckelhaus, you have your hand up. Please jump in. I'm not sure. I can't hear you properly, Mary. You are unmuted. I can hear, I can see, but can you give it a try?
Okay, how about this?
Yeah, that's a little better. If you can speak up.
Sorry, I'm moving to my phone. Is that better?
There you go. We can hear you. Thank you, Mary.
Sorry about that. Thank you to our Indonesian friends. I really appreciate this. I'm the director of the Natural Capital Project at Stanford. And our perspective is we work a lot with governments and development banks. And I'm very interested in what you have, what Rafael and Victor talked about earlier is what are either the bright spots in the Indonesian government or the big challenges in integrating between the central bank vision and activities and the ministries that will be implementing this roadmap that you have? Are there bright spots of this kind of whole of government approach that we all see will be needed, or are there big barriers that you see? I'd love to hear your reflections on that. Thank you.
That's very good. So who would like to answer that? And a brief answer if possible, so we can move on to our last speaker, please.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges in Indonesia in terms of switching our economy from carbon economy into a zero carbon economy is the investment, the appetite of investment in renewable energy. First of all, of course, because the price of renewable energy is quite high. And then the market in Indonesia, you need to compete. I mean, if you have renewable energy, unfortunately, you have to compete with coal and also with gas, but mostly with coal in terms of electricity and with the fuel for the transportation. So it means that we need kind of not subsidized investment, but investment with relatively competitive rates in order to make the investment in renewable energy will be as competitive as the fossil fuels. And then so far, the role of you mentioned about the MDBs, multilateral development banks, and also some development agencies from advanced countries is trying to do the blended financing, trying to bring the cost of money down for investment related to the effort to create net zero emission. I think that would be my short response, Victor.
Thank you very much. So we're going to, sorry, Dr. Zhang, for having you wait, but please, I mean, you have some prepared reflections as well that relates more to statistics and metrics that will be needed.
Right, thanks, Victor. It's a great pleasure to join the distinguished panelists today to share the experimental index work from our office and how these indices might help to assess social and environmental dimensions in finance. As mentioned by my fellow panelists just now, meeting environment, social, and governance ESG standards is gaining importance in the business and financial sectors. Now, 95% of SP global companies publish ESG information. However, there's a lack of a standard framework for defining material ESG factors. Then at UNDP, we have this Human Development Index that published 30 years ago. It's a simple composite index of 4 indicators covering 3 human development dimensions: health, education, and standard of living. Then this index has been utilized by agencies to evaluate social impacting a country. For example, the UN Principles of Responsible Investment list HDI, our Human Development Index, as one of the social indicators. Fitch Ratings also use HDI rankings to determine a country's human development, a quality of human capital. HSBC's Sovereign ESG model uses HDI as one of the 2 social sub-indicators. But compared to governance and social factors, environmental factors are given the least importance as we observed in current methodologies. One of the many reasons being the difficulty in assessing the financial impact of environmental risk. So the first slide I'm showing you today introduces you the planetary pressures adjusted HDI experimental index published in our last Human Development Report. This PHDI, Adjusted Human Development Index for planetary pressures in the Anthropocene. It is computed as the product of HDI and adjustment factor A, shown on this slide. This adjustment factor is derived from a country's carbon dioxide emissions per capita and material footprint per capita. By adjusting a country's level of human development by its per capita CO2 emissions and material footprint, PHDI could serve as an important tool that will reflect each country's level of human development after adjusting for the planetary pressures it imposes. Next slide, please. Recently, we continued the experimentation and tried a new exercise to combine the PHDI and another index we developed in the office in 2010, Inequality Adjusted HDI, and constructed this called Planetary Pressures and Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index, PI-HDI. So Inequality Adjusted HDI was developed and published in the office since 2010, while the HDI can be viewed as index of the average achievements in human development dimensions. The Inequality HDI is the level of human development when the distribution of populations is accounted for. So the new index, PI-HDI, is constructed as a product of IHDI and the planetary pressure adjustment factor A shown on the previous slide. So this PI-HDI can be interpreted as the level of human development when both inequalities in society and excessive pressures on the planet are accounted for. So this graph shows you the 144 countries, HDI, IHDI, PHDI, and PI-HDI values. But today's presentation is very brief, but I just want to show you some clear messages we can already see from the graph. We can see planetary pressures play relatively a larger role in discounting the HDI for countries with high development values, while inequalities are a bigger factor in discounting the HDI for low human development countries. Another clear message from this graph is that among the 54 countries in the very high HDI group, which we defined as the HDI values of 0.8 or higher, when you discount the HDI with inequality, 29 countries remain in this very high HDI group. But when planetary pressures are accounted for, only 10 countries remain in the very high HDI group. But when you look at PI-HDI, which means when we account for both inequality and planetary pressures, non-country maintain the very high level of human development. Next slide, please. Now let's look at HDI ranks, at PHDI, IHDI, and PI-HDI ranks. You also see only 5 countries from the top 10 HDI list managed to keep their top 10 spots according to PI-HDI. These 5 countries are Ireland, Switzerland, Germany, Sweden, and Denmark. But we also see some reordering here. There's a less variation at the lower end of the HDI rank. Next slide, please. As today's seminar is not only to stimulate discussion leading up to Stockholm +50 conference, but also in support of the Indonesia's G20 presidency. So I'm using the last slide as an opportunity to show the HDI, IHDI, PHDI, and PI-HDI values for the G20 countries. So here we don't have Saudi Arabia because we don't have the data to calculate its inequality HDI values. We look forward to having the opportunity to present our ongoing work on PHDI and PI-HDI at future Stockholm +50 workshops and the G20 meetings. Then I look forward to your comments and questions and more interactions during the Q&A session. Thanks, Victor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sang. I mean, it's always interesting to see these metrics and the differences they make as soon as you start integrating more factors than just GDP. So any questions from the audience or other panelists to anyone who has presented in the second part of this conversation? You're welcome to raise your hand or put it on the chat. Yeah, Carl Folke, you're welcome. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Victor, and thanks a lot to really interesting insights from the presentations. I was trying to link it back to what Pat Keyes started with, this this afternoon on the need for new transformations of society, that we can't do business as before if we want to do this, and to what extent Reza and Rafael and several others of you feel that the adjustments we hear now from investors and capital markets are really that big transformation, or whether it's still more of following and readjusting on the current pathway. Basically, stop doing harm and start doing good. Are we seeing a new vision for the future? Are we seeing a new purpose emerging, or is it more adjusting to the demands that are becoming required because of the climate and the planetary crisis? What is your sense on that shift?
That's a very good question from Carl. Folke, would anyone like to try to give us some reflection on that? Anyone from the panel?
I may, please.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, perhaps this relates to the increasing awareness. And we have seen that consumers are increasingly aware of these risks, and hence the demand side of the market are demanding changes, demanding more ESG or environmentally friendly products, and they want to make sure the supply chain of that product is governed with environment stewardship as well. So that is a big change. And now, as a result, investors start to see that unless the companies are incorporating these ESG issues, environmental issues, into their business models, then these companies will become stranded assets in the long run. So there is this pressure from the investors as well to these companies, to the producers, to start changing your behavior. Otherwise, I will not give money to you. I will not invest in you. And this is the growing trend right nowadays. Big investment firms, big asset managers in the world are start doing that. They want ESG criteria be included in the financial report, reporting, accounting reports and disclosures. And that is why we are working towards more standardized reporting and disclosure frameworks. And the G20 is trying to provide that good public, that much needed global public goods, so that this capital reallocation can happen faster, can move faster. So I share the optimism of Rafael that but the starting point is increasing awareness of the consumers. So if we keep, educating consumers about the existential threats to the earth, and then how those will affect their life, then I'm quite sure that moving forward, perhaps we will be in that area that in that donut, the sweet spot, the donut that Pete or from our colleague from Colorado mentioned in the first presentation. So yes, I think the finance community is taking this seriously, and as seen in the G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap.
Victor, I have a very good example following what Pak Reza just mentioned. I happen, aside from being a professor at University of Indonesia, I'm a non-executive director of basically mining and power company. And they used to work with coal, coal mining as well as coal power plant. And then they realized that, the future is not there. And they are trying to switch to more renewable as well as environmental friendly activities. And then a couple months ago, they declare, I mean, they sign kind of agreement with a company from other countries to set up electric motorcycle industry. And then after the announcement, the day after the announcement, the stock price of this company jumps very high. Usually it's relatively flat, but only on that day, because of that announcement, it jumps very high, meaning that the investor buying the idea that the sustainability or the ESG is the way of the future.
Interesting. Thank you so much. I think Karin Svensson from SIDA. Would you like to jump in here? Do you share this optimism? I think you work very closely with Swedish investors, but also the global investor network. And do you share this optimism? Is the finance sector really moving?
Yeah, thank you so much, Victor. And yes, I'm Karin Svensson from SIDA, and I work with global investors for sustainable development, that is UN convened with 30 of the world's largest institutional investors and a few companies, and also Swedish investors. And I can confirm, I also think there's a strong drive towards investing for the good and doing well by doing good, etc. But yeah, sometimes there's a little bit help needed. And we see in the GIS, and this is a question to the panel, actually, around the need for global political action to incentivize and penalize. So I mean, GIST, they do all kinds of commitments, and they would like to put the price on externalities, for example, the company's emissions, to put a price on them. And many of them are arguing for a global carbon price, etc. And they are interested in investing in transition, but it's not so easy always to figure out the good economical model for this. So my question to the panel is, what are the needs and possibilities for global economic incentives and penalties around this to incentivize and to penalize? That's my question.
Good question. And also fits very nicely into the fact that this is contributing to Stockholm Plus 50. So what could happen and should be done during Stockholm Plus 50 related to this? Who would like to give it a shot to give some reflection?
Yeah, let me start just by saying that every country trying to now set their own agenda for phasing out, let's say, from fossil fuel and trying to be a net zero economy. Of course, every country has different timetable. For example, Indonesia now will try to declare that by 2060, yeah, still a long time to go, Indonesia will go into a net zero emission country, and coal will be phased out by 2056. Of course, it has been, communicated with some international agencies, including the MDBs. And one of our MDBs, Asian Development Bank, I believe has a very nice program as incentive to accelerate the retirement of coal power plant. They call it the program Energy Transition Mechanism. Basically, they will finance any country or any company that will try to retire their coal power plant much earlier. So, for example, if the coal power plant actually still has the contract, purchasing power agreement, let's say until 2040, then if they can retire in 2030, then there will be financing for ADB to that company in order to switch their coal power plant into renewable power plant, renewable energy power plant. I believe that's the type of incentive that now most of developing countries are looking for. How can they finance early retirement of coal power plant? Otherwise, they might better to wait until they feel that they are ready to be phasing out totally from the coal. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Dear friends and colleagues, I think we have to wrap up. We're running out of time. This was a very, very rich conversation, and I think I'm going to let Pedro try to summarize this in a good way for us. Pedro.
Thank you, Victor. No, it was a joy and a delight, as I expected, to be able to participate and listen to the discussion. Let me just offer 3 reflections, not a summary as such, because I don't think it's possible to summarize the richness of the contributions and the discussion. First, I retain what Ann-Sophie said at the very beginning, that we may not know everything, but we don't need to know everything to act. We know enough to take many drastic measures, be it on the policy realm, be it in our individual lives, be it decisions by business, to change the trajectories that we are in. Secondly, Victor, you asked, so what is different today as we go to Stockholm plus 50 compared to 50 years ago, when Stockholm convened the first meeting in 1972? Well, I think the discussion today showed that many things are different. I don't think we would have seen central banks, Rafael, Pacbabang, Reza, the interest, the attention that the financial and economic world is paying to these challenges, I think is quite new. We have very high expectations about G20 this year, so we're looking very closely to what the Indonesia presidency of the G20 will do. We will be supporting this effort, hopefully, as part of the collaboration also with the Stockholm Resilience Center and the Beijer Institute. Hopefully, Stockholm plus 50 is going to give an impetus to this change that is already happening. I was observing recently some data on capital expenditure by oil companies, because as you know, the price of oil dropped quite rapidly. It is now increasing, and one of the reasons why it's increasing is that many oil companies are not doing capital investments to the extent that they were doing in the past. So they are already reacting to all of these signals, even though we know that prices are not reflective of the challenges as they should be. But there's already a lot of change happening. So this is, I think, quite different compared to what was happening 50 years ago. But the final message is that the change is not happening quickly enough. And so that's why hopefully the G20 this year, Stockholm plus 15 are going to really give a push towards more fundamental change. Hopefully the work that we're doing on data, statistics, indicators will help the data that Jens presented. And I would conclude by saying that prices here are going to be key. That's how I started the seminar. Prices need to be aligned to reflect the real risks, not only of climate change, but the Anthropocene risks more broadly. But I think it's important also to emphasize purpose. I think that we need to highlight the importance of purpose. It's clear actually in the financial and investment world how important purpose is becoming in terms of people making investment decisions. But I think that purpose is something that, working along with prices and incentives, is a fundamental driver of change going forward. So thank you, everyone. Continuing the discussion, hopefully, and all of us have an obligation to put pressure to make change happen more quickly. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Pedro. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you, Victor. Pak Bambang, izin.